the next few weeks, I'm going to be looking at one topic, although I will not make them, I will try to do them as individual topics, but they're all going to be dealing with the same thing, with something that is really significant in terms of our looking at the Bible and how we look at the Bible. Most of us, I think, were brought up with the idea that we have the first 5 books of the Bible as the books of Moses, or we call the Pentateuch. We've talked about the Pentateuch many times. Another thing that I would like to talk about a little bit is something else that we run into. When we take a look at the Bible carefully, we find out that the book of Deuteronomy doesn't really belong there. The book of Deuteronomy is quite different from the first 4 books. One of the things that makes it different is that probably it was the first book that was written that showed up in the Bible as such. The other 4 books showed up maybe a couple hundred years later on, maybe around 400. This book of Deuteronomy appears on the scene approximately 600 BC. What is also quite interesting about the book of Deuteronomy is that it is followed by 6 other books that are very much in the same style as that book of Deuteronomy. We often refer to those as the Deuteronomic histories. The Deuteronomic histories are the ones that follow the book of Deuteronomy. They form what is called a heptateuch. And in those Deuteronomic histories, we have a good share of the Bible stories that most of us are familiar with. I'd like to talk just a little bit about what is there in terms of what it is that we're going to be looking at. The book of Deuteronomy sort of stands by itself, and it forms, you might say, the basis for what we find in the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. You want to take a look at that slide, you'll notice that the first thing I say about Joshua is that as a book of the Deuteronomic histories, it's of little significance as far as history is concerned. It was very, very different. I think I've mentioned this several times, that we look at the stories that we have in the book of Joshua, we find out that they are not verifiable at all. Probably one of the most familiar stories is the story of the falling of the walls of Jericho. It's true the walls of Jericho fell down, probably by an earthquake, but maybe about 200 years before Joshua showed up there. But it was a known fact that something had happened at Jericho. Same thing is true with the book of Ai, or the story of Ai, the burning of the city. In the book of Joshua, the city is destroyed by Joshua and his troops. Actually, at the time of Joshua, there was nothing there but a ruined city. And the word Ai means ruined city. Judges, on the other hand, is a little bit different. It may be one of the most precious books that we have in the Old Testament, in that it is a written account of what might well have been nothing but oral, legendary history for maybe about 500 years before it was ever written down. What's surprising about the Judges is that what we find in the book of Judges, some things that seem to bear on secular history at that time, which makes it quite different from the book of Deuteronomy, in which we don't find very much, book of Joshua, which we don't find that correspondence. When we get down to Samuel and Kings, what we find here are some books that record the history quite accurately as far as biblical history is concerned. When we go through this, we're not going to go through it in great detail, but we'll be talking about parts of it. You're going to find out that some of the most familiar stories that we have from the Old Testament come from Samuel and from Kings. Some of the most memorable characters that we have from the Old Testament, personalities, are from Samuel and Kings. We'll be looking at some of that. 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, quite unique in many regards, in that we get an introduction to some parts of Israel history that's quite unique. 1st and 2nd Kings takes us right up to the time that the Israelites went into captivity around 587 BC. Actually, there's even a mention of something that may have taken place in 560 BC, but the history doesn't go any further than that. Is that all that we have in history? No, we have the book of Chronicles as well, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. I will in time talk a little bit about that, but other than to say it is not nearly as accurate in terms of biblical history as our Samuel and Kings. But you'll notice I've mentioned this as biblical history. I came across a statement in a book that I've been reading. I can't remember the author's name now. Armstrong, I think it was. Karen Armstrong. And she used the word scientific history. And I thought about that a little bit. What does that mean about scientific history? Well, she was talking there about what we in this class have often referred to as secular history, a history of things that have actually taken place. Well, something that is also true about secular history is that some of it is not accurate either. When you talk about scientific history, you're talking about having things that are really actually accurate. Very often accurate in terms of numbers, and accurate in terms of being able to be verified. Sometimes it can be verified by the fact that it can be reproduced, or it can be verified by some other history that corresponds to it. Having worked as a scientist for just about a half a century, I'm well aware of what scientific writing is. When you're writing for a journal, for example, we find out that not only can we describe what we think we have done, but they also want a section that said experimental. What did you actually do, and what can we do to repeat it to find out whether or not this is accurate? And we're expected usually to put in some good experimental evidence along with the text of the article. If it can't be verified by experiments, what's probably true about that scientific history or that scientific paper? It might not be true. We had an occasion, I won't go into the details of a student somewhere who did research for his PhD and gave the professor just what the professor wanted. Not what he found, but what he thought the professor wanted. And later on, it turned out that none of the work could be reproduced. That was a disaster. We would call sort of a scandal in academic circles that could happen, because that is not sort of thing allowed. So when we talk about scientific history, we're talking about something a little bit different. We like to look at scientific history. One thing you want to keep in mind about scientific history is, although it may be accurate in some regards, it does not necessarily mean that what you are reading is the final word. Just about all scientific history is capable of being reevaluated, and often is reevaluated several times. As a matter of fact, I find it rather interesting if you were to take a look at books that were written about World War II during World War II and compare them with books that are being written now about World War II, they might correspond in terms of the facts, but not in terms of the interpretation. So there can be changes in interpretation. When we go through the biblical history, however, you want to keep in mind, it is not scientific, it is biblical. How would you describe biblical history? I've thought about that quite a bit. I would say that biblical history sort of boils down to this. It tells about the events of these people in terms of their relationship with their God. That's what makes it biblical. And what we find in the Deuteronomic histories is very true. In the Deuteronomic histories, particularly, well, actually Samuel and Kings, we find that even though we're getting very close to being rather accurate in terms of some of the events as far as their history is concerned, there is always in the background this idea, how is this related to the relationship of these people with their God? When we get in the book of Kings, we'll find out very often there are times when we don't learn very much at all about the king, other than that he was wicked and he did not follow the laws. In other words, we find a relationship, and it is recorded. Now, it turns out that this Deuteronomic history is something that we also know quite a bit about in terms of some other things. And what are those other things? We can determine from the way the history is written certain things that are rather unique. We can figure out when it probably was written. what part of the history was this actually written. Not only when it was written, where it was written. Why is it important as to where it might have been written? Also, why it was written. Is there a reason for writing this? It turns out there were reasons for writing this. And with a little bit of luck in putting all those things together, we can make a pretty good educated guess as to just when and where this was written and who may have written it and who may actually have been the author of these books that we're looking at that we find so important in terms of our history. Actually, when I started to think about this series of lessons about this Deuteronomic history, I actually was going to call it the Shiloh connection. Remember the French connection? How we find a rather interesting thing in the Old Testament. Very often the name of a city shows up. The name is Shiloh. It shows up in only certain places, and the fact that it shows up only in certain places gives us a good clue as to who may have written it and maybe why it was written. If we're going to follow this Shiloh history, we find out we have to go all the way back to what we know about Shiloh in terms of the Old Testament itself. And here it gets kind of interesting because Shiloh itself, I think I've got a picture of it, Shiloh itself, is just a very small city here in Ephraim. It's somewhat north of Jerusalem. They don't know exactly where Shiloh is. There are a lot of archaeologists that think they have found Shiloh, but at one time it was apparently a very important part of the history of these people. This is Shiloh up here, and when we get to what we read about Shiloh, it was a center of the Israelite religion when they came out of the desert into the Promised Land. Why? Because it appears that is where the Ark of the Covenant, which was developed while they were in the desert, and the tabernacle were set up in Shiloh. And there actually was a center of worship in Shiloh. This next verse, I think, is rather interesting because it is the first verse of the first chapter of 1 Samuel. And what does it say? There was a certain man of Ramoth Gilead of the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, and he had 2 wives. Now this man used to go up year by year from his city of worship to sacrifice to the Lord of hosts at Shiloh. These first couple of verses indicate that for some time, maybe for as long as maybe a half a century, people have been going up to Shiloh to worship. And this man would go with his family to worship in Shiloh. In other words, according to what we have in Samuel here, Shiloh was a center of worship as far as the Israelites were concerned. We can ask a lot of questions, how did this come about? It turns out in this story, however, what we're told is that during one of these visits, the wife of this man, Hannah, was found praying. And here was the high priest at that time, the high priest in the tabernacle in Shiloh, listening to her prayer. She was the wife of this man Elkanah, but she had no children. Another wife did have children, but Hannah did not have children. She was praying for a son. Here's another picture of Hannah praying for a son. In her prayer, she made a promise that if a son were given to her, she would dedicate that son to the tabernacle. And sure enough, she becomes pregnant and she has a son. Here's the son when he was about 4 or 5 years old, and he's taken to Eli, and he is to spend his life now in the tabernacle. This, of course, was Samuel when he was a boy. Samuel lives in the tabernacle. Samuel lives with the priests in the tabernacle in Shiloh. We find out when he was about 12 years old, he has a dream one night. He thinks Eli is calling him, and I think most of you remember this story and are quite familiar with this next slide of this 12-year-old boy going to Eli and say, "What did you call me for?" And Eli makes it very clear to him, "I didn't call you. You were being called by the Lord." And this is the time, according to the book of Samuel, when Samuel is being told that he has a responsibility. He is going to be a part of the history when he's only 12 years old. Now, obviously, what we'd like to do is to go from this birth to a period where we find him acting as the agent of the Lord. Samuel, they believe, was born about 1010 BC, about 10 years before the millennium change. When you go to the book of Samuel, you find out that, if you can read this, we get from the birth of Samuel here, and we jump all the way down to 1070, a period of 40 years. And so we really do not encounter Samuel again until he's 40 years old. Why? Because as far as the history is concerned, the historian really wants to tell us about what happened here in Shiloh that was significant. If you look at this, you'll find out this was a period where there was called the Battle of Shiloh. I'll give you a little short story on it, very short story. Shiloh disappears for all practical purposes after 1070. The only times that it's mentioned is as a city of desolation, because apparently it had been destroyed by the Philistines. Now let's look at a little background of the 40 years between the time that Samuel was born and this battle. The Israelites came into Palestine approximately 1200 BC. At about the same time, another group of people came into Palestine, and they were the Philistines. They were in the southwestern part of Palestine. If you recall, what we have in the books of Samuel and Kings is battle after battle involving the Israelites with the Philistines. They were in a constant battle with finally the Philistines are overcome, but there is much in those books about the situations with the Philistines. Now, how did this battle come about? Why? Well, it was because of the fact that Eli, as the chief priest, should be giving forth sons that would follow him. He had two sons. I think they're mentioned here. They're not mentioned by name. Hophni and Phinehas were his two sons. And every year, every day, when somebody would come to make a sacrifice in the temple, they would bring the sacrifice to the temple where the sacrifice would be slaughtered. And then then the meat would be put into a boiling pot. And then the priests would take a fork and tuck out the meat that they wanted and sell it. The rest of the meat could be used by the person that had brought the sacrifice, and it can be his sacrifice, and he can have a meal with that sacrifice. Well, what happened is that Phinehas and Hophni were in a habit of trying to get at that meat before it got too spoiled, too boiled, and pull out the biggest, best chunks so they could sell them and leave the people with what was left. Actually, they got to the point where they were urging people, don't put it in the pot, I want to get it raw, I want to sell it on the market this way. This was not acceptable. What we're told is that as far as Eli and others were concerned, these men were not obeying God in the proper, were not following through in terms of the sacrifice in the way they should. What we're given here is a little bit of the detail. Thus the sin of the young men was very great in the sight of the Lord, for the men treated the offering of the Lord with contempt. Now Israel went out to battle against the Philistines. They encamped near Ebenezer, and the Philistines encamped near Ephek. The Philistines drew up a line against Israel, and when the battle spread, Israel was defeated by the Philistines, who slew about 4,000 men on the field. Now, I'm questioning where the people in Shiloh could come up with an armed force of 4,000 men to be slaughtered. Like I say, the numbers are not that reliable. However, the effect of the battle was quite reliable, and that is that they were defeated. How to avoid this? And when the troops came to the camp, the elders of Israel said, "Why has the Lord put us to rout today before the Philistines? Let us bring the ark of the covenant of the Lord here from Shiloh, that he may come among us and save us from the power of our enemies. In other words, they thought, hey, we lost to the Philistines this time, but let's take the ark along with us next time. If we have the ark of the Lord, then we will not be defeated. Then we will have God with us. So take courage and acquit yourselves like men. This is talking to the Philistine. This is the Philistine talking. Oh yeah, I skipped some verses here. The head of the Philistine army says, "Take courage and acquit yourselves like men, O Philistines, lest you become slaves to the Hebrews, as they have been to you. Acquit yourselves like men and fight." So the Philistines fought, and Israel was defeated. And they fled, and every man to his home. And there was a very great slaughter, for there fell of Israel 30,000 foot soldiers. Again, the numbers are a little hard to take here. Shiloh would have had to been a city of well over a couple 100,000 to have 30,000 men die as soldiers. But they were defeated. I think I have a picture of the defeat. No, it doesn't show here. I think I did have a picture, and it showed the ark being taken. There, I think. Can you see the ark back here? The ark is being taken by the Philistines. The Philistines took that ark, and guess what they did with it? They brought it into their own territory. They said, if this is something as special as far as the Israelites are concerned, maybe it's going to be special for us. And so they brought the ark into the Philistine territory. However, when the ark had been taken, and the people had, the army had been defeated, we find out the news has to come back to Shiloh. When Eli heard the sound of the outcry, he said, "What is this uproar?" Then the man hastened and came to Eli. Now Eli was 98 years old, and his eyes were set so that he could not see. And the man said to Eli, "I am he who has come from the battle. I fled from the battle today." And he said, "How did it go, my sons?" My son. He who brought the tidings answered and said, "Israel has fled before the Philistines, and there has been a great slaughter among the people. Your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the ark of God has been captured." When he mentioned the ark of God, Eli fell over backwards from the seat by the side of the gate, and his neck was broken, and he died, for he was an old man and heavy, and he had judged Israel for 40 years. I think I have one picture. Actually, there are at least a dozen good pictures of Eli falling down, breaking his neck, and he's dead. We don't know exactly what happened, but we do know from other parts of the scripture that the Philistines must have come into Shiloh and maybe burned part of the city. Who really knows? We don't know. One of the things that we do find, however, is that the way the histories were written is that statements can be made later on that you can infer that certain things must have taken place. Do you follow me? From what is said, you can say, that may be an explanation of what is going on. We'll get back to that in just a moment. Before that, however, let's take a look at what happened after the battle. After the battle, the Philistines took the ark and they took it back into the Philistine territory. And when they got it into the Philistine territory, let me see if I got a map here. When they took it back, this is Shiloh. Here is where the battle of Ebenezer and Aphek. This is where the Philistines were, and this is where the Israelites were. And they took the ark and took it to Ashdod. Ashdod was one of the principal cities of the Philistines at that time. That didn't work out too well. People started getting sick, and they started having boils and rashes of some sort. So they moved it on to Ekron. There the matter even got worse. And finally, when they took it to Dacon, when they got to Dacon, they found out that their god Dacon, fell off from his altar and it was crushed down and broke because it was in the presence of the ark. The Philistines soon caught on. It is not a good idea to have this thing around here. Let's get rid of it. They thought, let's just give it back to the Israelites. And so they made every effort to return the thing to the Israelites. And when the Ark of the Lord, and then they put the Ark of the Lord on a cart, and the box with the golden mice and the images of tumors. In the ark, what they had done was taken some mice that had been made into gold as idols, and tumors that they'd gotten from the diseases that were developed, and put them in the ark. And the cows that drew the ark went straight in the direction of Beth Shemesh, along one highway, lowing as they went. And they turned neither to the right nor to the left, and the lords of the Philistines went after them as far as the border of Beth Shemesh. Now the people of Beth Shemesh were reaping their wheat harvest in the valley. And when they lifted up their eyes and saw the ark, they rejoiced to see it. I think I have a picture of the ark. There's the picture of reaping in the fields. There they see the ark being brought in, and they rejoiced to see it. And they put the ark of the Lord. That's the second slide. They took the ark into the city, and guess what? They opened it up and looked into it. They weren't supposed to do this. Also in this same chapter it says, and he slew some of the men of Beth Shemesh because they looked into the ark of the Lord. He slew 70 men of them, and the people mourned because the Lord had made a great slaughter among the people. And the men of Beth Shemesh said, who is able to stand up before the Lord, this holy God, and to whom shall we go up away from us? So they sent messengers to the inhabitants of Kiriath-Jearim, saying, the Philistines have returned the ark of the Lord. Come down and take it up to you. What do you call that? Passing the buck. Let's give it to somebody else. So they did. And the men of Kiriath-Jearim came and took the ark of the Lord and brought it to the house of Abinadab on the hill. And they consecrated his son Eleazar to have charge of the ark of the Lord. And from that day the ark was lodged at Kiriath-Jearim a long time past, some 20 years, and all the house of Israel lamented after the Lord. It just stayed there. Actually, what did eventually happen? David brought the ark back into Jerusalem and brought it into the temple. But for 20 years, it remained in that house. Apparently, in that city, there is a cathedral, a Catholic cathedral, where they think that's where the house of this Abinadab was, and that's where the ark had been. Now we'll go back a little bit. There's another person that we'd like to know a little bit about. And that is what happened to Samuel. By this time, Samuel would have been 40 years old. He was not a boy any longer. He had been in the temple of Shiloh for the better part of his life, maybe 35 years or so that he lived in Shiloh. Was he very well versed in the religion that these people were practicing? Probably as well as anyone. But he got out of Shiloh. And what he did, he went to his home. His home is in Ramah. That's where his father and mother were. And what he did was yearly, he made a circuit going to these cities and preaching what? Preaching the gospel. Well, I wouldn't call it the gospel. He was preaching the religion of these Israelites. If you take a look at this, you'll notice that this is not too far from Jerusalem. And not too far from Jerusalem about here. And I could not find a map that would show all of this. But what is right down about here in Jerusalem? Bethlehem. Who lives in Bethlehem? Jesse and his sons, including David. It may very well be that David and his family became acquainted with God through Samuel. We don't know. There may be other ways that they had learned about the Israelite religion. We don't know. But we do know this, or we can infer this. We can infer the fact that there seemed to be a relationship that existed between Samuel and the house of Jesse. Why? Well, because we know that later on, Samuel went to the house of Jesse and did what? Anointed David to be the new king. That is all coming in next week's lesson, how that came about and why that was necessary. Okay, that's the trials there. Now I'm going to do some more inferring. What I had intended to do was to talk about the priests of Shiloh. As a matter of fact, I think I entitled this one as the priests of Shiloh. We've only heard about 3 priests, Eli and his 2 sons. Eli, we know, is dead. He fell over and broke his neck when he found out about the battle being lost. Hophni and Phinehas are both killed in that battle. I didn't have the scripture part of it, but they are killed, and Eli finds out that his sons were killed. It turned out when that news came, Phinehas had a wife who was pregnant, and the turmoil was too much for her, and she suddenly gave birth to a son, and that son is named Ichabod. Ichabod turns out to be the father of somebody else, Ahimelech. But we'll get to all that next week probably. What I'd like to talk about right now is that in Shiloh, there must have been other priests besides just those 3. As a matter of fact, if there were people that were going around and converting people into this religion of the Israelites, there might have been priests in a lot of the other places, and they would be regarded as priests of what? Priests that are preaching about what Israelite religion is. They are priests of Shiloh. We hear absolutely nothing about these priests of Shiloh until 58 years after the destruction of Shiloh. But what shows up is inferred that they must have been there, and they must have been there for a fairly long time. But before we get into that, with a little bit of time that I got left, I want to talk about something else that I think is rather significant, and that is how many people actually crossed over the Jordan River with Moses and went to Shiloh. The answer is we don't really know. If we go to the book of Exodus, we find out that when Moses left Egypt, he left with 600 men and their wives and children, and with others, with a crowd of maybe 2 million people. Did 2 million people cross the Jordan River and go into Shiloh? Absolutely not. As a matter of fact, I've mentioned this many times, there's no evidence at all that any 2 million people ever left Egypt at any one time, nor that they lived it in the desert for 40 years. Well, how many people did go with Moses? The answer is we really don't know. We really don't know. One of the ideas is that it may have been just a group of people that he had attracted with his idea of religion that attracted a number of people, maybe in the hundreds. And it could very well be that he did go through the desert with maybe 100 or 200, at the maybe 300 people, and they were the ones that crossed the Jordan River and went to Shiloh. The other thing that becomes interesting here is something else that I think is very significant, and that is that it was not long before there were people in the environs of Shiloh that were getting into the same religion, this religion of Moses. Now, what was unique about the religion of Moses? There are 2 things. Now, this is speculation. There are 2 things. One of them is that it was monotheistic. In contrast to a lot of the religions at that time, where there were dozens of in the Canaanite religion in particular, I think there are 30 different gods that are designated as gods that they have to be ready to worship. But with the religion of the Israelites, there was just one God. This was monotheism. Was this original with Moses? No, not actually. There were monotheistic people before that. One of the Egyptian pharaohs by the name of Akhenaten was monotheistic and worshipped only the sun. He was not a popular guy, but it was an introduction of the idea that we don't worship a variety of gods, but we worship only one God. The idea of monotheism. The other thing that's rather attractive is this. I'm sure you have heard this before, and that is that Abraham and his family came into Canaan about the same time as something else was happening back in Mesopotamia. And what's happening back in Mesopotamia is there came on the scene a very, very affected ruler. And who was that? Hammurabi. Now, have you heard that name before? Have you heard of the Code of Hammurabi? What was unique about the Code of Hammurabi? What was unique about that code is that it set up certain laws that men were to follow if they were going to be right, if they were going to be good men. This was in terms of the Babylonian society. One of the things that we find in the book of Deuteronomy, now remember, this book of Deuteronomy was written many years later, was that a good part of Deuteronomy signifies what the name is. You know what the name Deuteronomy means? Second reading of the law. In other words, you find that Deuteronomy has a lot in it about the way the Israelites should be worshiping in following the law. As a matter of fact, and you've heard me say this in this class many times before, what was developed out of this was the Deuteronomic theology. And that is God will honor and respect the righteous. They will be blessed. The unrighteous will be punished. The righteous will receive blessings. The wicked will not receive blessings. In the book of Deuteronomy, you know how this is given to the people in the book of Deuteronomy? They're claiming that the book of Deuteronomy is the last speech that Moses gave before the Israelites crossed over into the Jordan. Now, did Moses actually give that speech? I don't really know if he did or not. But I can say this, that by the time this book of Deuteronomy was written, it became very important that following the law was significant in terms of their following the religion. That made that religion rather attractive to a lot of people. The monotheism and the fact that we have a set of laws that we are to follow. And I can see how people would be attracted to Judaism due to those factors alone. By the way, is there any evidence that that has actually happened? It is still alive today, and there are people being converted to Judaism all the time. It is still a very attractive religion. What was the thing that St. Paul, the great missionary, did that was significant in terms of his life? And that is to make his last missionary journey into Jerusalem to tell them what? There is more than just following the law. There is Jesus Christ. And what Paul wanted to do was to point out, yes, following the law may be the way of Judaism, but Jesus is pointing out another way. I came across a statement that I found very interesting, and that is that you could say that the book of Deuteronomy, when it was written, approximately, I think, 650 BC, and I'll explain why that stands out. That was the birth of something else. That was the birth of Phariseeism. Now, what is Pharisee? What is a Pharisee? You remember what a Pharisee is? A Pharisee is somebody that's not a part of the Jewish religion. He's not a priest. A Pharisee is always a layman. He's always a layman. And what is this layman always trying to do? Follow the law as close as he possibly can. And like I say, there are reasons for thinking that this whole idea of Pharisee and Phariseeism stems from the writing of this book of Deuteronomy, because of the attractiveness of saying, now, if I follow the law, everything will be well. I find a real fallacy in that, is that if you follow the law, then guess what? Then God owes you something. And I don't know if that is really what we want to think about. In other words, if I follow the law, God owes me this, because I have been very astute about this. What Paul was aware of in encountering Christ is there was much more to it, and that is that the being in right with God is not going to come from anything we do and accomplish by following the law, but it's going to be the gift that is given to us by God himself. But you can see why Judaism, or if you want to call it Judaism, or the Israelite religion, might be attractive to people. Maybe only a few hundred people were with Moses when he came across the desert. But it wasn't long before there were a number of other people that were saying, hey, this is not a bad way to worship. Elkanah, the husband of Hannah, the father of Samuel, was one of these people. And it may very well be this is how David's family, or Jesse and David's brothers, all became in part of this religion that became so important in the stories that follow. Next week, we're going to pick this story up after this 58-year span from the time of that battle when Shiloh was destroyed, and go to a verse that is dated in 1012, 58 years later. And it said that David went to the priests of Shiloh. All of a sudden, the priests show up after 58 years. How did they get there? What were they doing in the meantime? Next week, we'll take a look at that.